German prisoners of war stepped into captivity carrying not just their uniforms and worn boots, but also the weight of years of propaganda. From their earliest days in the barracks and training grounds, they had been told a story about America, a story crafted carefully by the Nazi regime. In that story, the United States was not a serious opponent. It was portrayed as a land of weak men, a society softened by comfort, dulled by material excess, and divided by democracy. German officers reminded their soldiers that Americans lacked the discipline and iron resolve of the Reich. Newspapers repeated that American soldiers were poorly trained, led by politicians rather than warriors, and spoiled by luxury. Films, pamphlets, and radio broadcasts hammered home the same theme. Decadent America would collapse at the first true test of war. For many Germans, this belief grew into unshakable arrogance. They compared their own military tradition, the victories of the Blitzkrieg across Poland, France, and the Balkans, to the clumsy image of American recruits supposedly fumbling with rifles and abandoning hardship for comfort. The Reich had spent years teaching its men that hardship itself was strength, that scarcity built character, while abundance bred weakness. In this view, the very wealth of the United States was proof it could never sustain a prolonged war. A nation that wasted its energy on frivolous luxuries like jazz clubs, Hollywood films, and consumer goods could not possibly stand against the disciplined machine of the Wehrmacht. When these soldiers were captured in North Africa, Italy, or France, they carried this certainty with them into captivity. Many marched into prisoner trains with heads held high, convinced their time in American hands would only confirm what they had always believed, that America was soft, superficial, and incapable of true strength. They did not yet realize that the comforts they mocked would become the very weapons that dismantled their faith in Nazi ideology. The arrogance that colored German views of America did not emerge in a vacuum. It was reinforced by a string of battlefield triumphs that seemed to prove the Nazi worldview correct. The lightning victory in France during 1940 left an impression of unstoppable power. German officers, many of whom would later find themselves in American camps, recalled how entire French divisions collapsed in weeks, how the once feared French army surrendered while German troops marched through Paris, with flags raised high. In their minds, if France, the strongest military in Europe, had fallen so quickly, what chance did the soft Americans have? Victories in the Balkans only deepened that confidence. Rapid campaigns in Yugoslavia and Greece demonstrated German speed and coordination. Soldiers boasted that no nation could resist the combination of tanks, aircraft, and disciplined infantry that made the Wehrmacht's reputation. The propaganda machine amplified every victory, framing them as proof that Germany's discipline and sacrifice outweighed the supposed decadence of democracy. Even in North Africa, where the harsh desert demanded endurance, the Afrika Korps under Rommel gave German soldiers reason to believe they were the superior breed. Tales of American supply blunders, tanks stuck in sand, and soldiers unprepared for desert warfare circulated widely. For many captured later in those same deserts, the memory of their own battlefield successes still lingered. These men carried into captivity not despair but the stubborn belief that they belonged to an unbeatable army. To them, America remained a distant, wealthy land with no real understanding of war. Their victories had taught them a dangerous lesson that discipline and ideology would always defeat comfort and abundance. When the trains arrived to carry them into captivity, many German prisoners braced themselves for misery. They expected cattle cars, straw on the floor, and weeks of hunger treatment they themselves had given to Soviet prisoners. Instead, the first steps onto American transport left them unsettled. The cars were not filthy wagons but passenger trains with padded seats. Windows were clear, curtains neatly hanging, and overhead racks ready for belonging. The sight alone was enough to stir disbelief among men who had spent years fighting in deserts, mud, and rubble. Inside, they found dining cars where food was served not as rations ladled into tin mess kits, but on real plates with silverware. Coffee flowed in porcelain cups, and bread came warm with butter. Some prisoners whispered to each other that this must be a trick, an attempt at propaganda to soften them before interrogation. Yet no lectures followed, no staged performances. The Americans simply fed them. Guards chatted casually, some even joking, treating the prisoners less like hated enemies and more like men passing through a long journey. The contrast was unsettling. German soldiers had been taught to believe their captors would be cruel, but instead they encountered comfort greater than most had known at home. A padded seat after months of desert campaigns felt luxurious, almost decadent. The clatter of dishes in the dining car carried an unnerving message. This was ordinary for America. What to German soldiers felt like privilege, to Americans was routine. The seeds of confusion began to sprout. If this was how their enemies treated prisoners, what kind of country had they been fighting against? As the trains rolled deeper into the American heartland, the prisoners stared through the windows with widening eyes. Night had fallen, but instead of darkness, the countryside glowed. Towns shimmered with electric lights, streets lined with lamps, homes glowing warmly, factories illuminated like daytime. Even small villages sparkled, their shops still open, neon signs humming above doorways. For men used to the dim world of blackout curtains and rationed electricity, the sight was otherworldly. In Germany, the night meant silence and shadows. Entire cities went dark to avoid bombing raids. Families gathered by candlelight, whispering to conserve fuel. Children grew up fearing the sound of aircraft engines overhead. The war had turned every light into a target, every spark into a danger. To see America so brightly lit, with no fear, no hesitation, was like stepping into another reality. Some prisoners muttered that it had to be staged, that the Americans must have lit up these towns just for their benefit. But the endless glow kept appearing. Town after town, mile after mile. There were too many lights, too much normalcy for it to be anything but genuine. A gnawing disbelief spread among them. If this was ordinary America, then everything they had been told was wrong. The lights represented more than electricity. They symbolized safety, abundance, and confidence. To German soldiers whose families lived in rubble-strewn cities and bomb shelters, this display of casual prosperity was overwhelming. It was not victory parades or grand speeches that unsettled them most, but the quiet glow of homes untouched by war. For the first time, many felt a shadow of doubt that their own nation could ever match such power. When the prisoners were marched past America's shipyards, the first impression was not just noise and steel but speed. The scale was staggering. Rows of Liberty ships rising from skeleton frames into completed giants in what seemed like the blink of an eye. German officers had grown up with an image of shipbuilding as a slow, meticulous process, measured in years, not weeks. A warship in their minds was something planned for decades, launched with ceremony and produced in small numbers. Yet here in American yards they watched vessels slide into the water almost as quickly as trucks rolled off assembly line. The numbers were whispered among the prisoners and spread like wildfire. One Liberty ship completed in less than 5 days, sometimes faster than German engineers could even repair a damaged U-boat. Entire fleets were being created at a pace that defied logic. To men schooled in scarcity, it felt impossible. They stared at cranes moving with precision, welding torches flaring non-stop, and assembly lines where parts clicked together with industrial rhythm. It was not just the ships themselves, but the endless flow of workers. Thousands of men and women, many too young or too old for the front, filled the yards day and night. To the prisoners it looked less like war and more like an unstoppable machine of production, grinding forward without pause. For German soldiers who had been taught that American abundance was weakness, this sight was a revelation. The very comfort they had mocked, the industrial might of a consumer nation, was now building the tools of war at a scale they could not hope to match. For the first time, disbelief turned into stunned realization. They were fighting against a giant. If the Liberty ships themselves were staggering, the machinery that supported them was even more overwhelming. From the train windows and guarded walks through industrial districts, the prisoners saw ports that stretched beyond the horizon. Towering cranes swung effortlessly, lifting steel beams the size of houses as though they were toys. Docks bustled with movement, trains unloading cargo directly onto ships, trucks rolling in endless lines, warehouses stacked high with supplies. In Germany, docks were places of scarcity, where workers rationed coal and fought shortages with patchwork repairs. Here the prisoners saw abundance flowing like a river, Steel arrived in unbroken streams, lumber piled in mountains, and barrels of oil lined up in ranks that seemed endless. Ships did not wait for parts or crews. As soon as one launched, another took its place. Some prisoners whispered in disbelief. How could so much be organized with such precision? How could a single nation across an ocean keep these ports humming day and night without faltering? Even more shocking was the diversity of the workforce. Women in overalls operated cranes, young men guided forklifts, and older workers directed traffic with practiced ease. The system ran like clockwork, with no pause and no visible weakness. To the German POWs it felt cinematic, unreal, as if they had stepped inside a propaganda film too large to be faked. Their own nation, drained by shortages and crumbling under bombing raids, could never compete with this spectacle. The awe they felt was edged with fear. They now knew the war was not just lost on the battlefield, it was being lost in the factories and ports. The first time a bottle of Coca-Cola was handed to a German prisoner, silence fell across the group. At first many thought it was a mistake. Prisoners of war expected rations of water, perhaps thin soup or black coffee, not a sweet fizzy drink served in a glass bottle, cold to the touch. Some stared at the caramel-colored liquid with suspicion, unsure whether it was a trick or some form of propaganda. But as the cap hissed open and the first sip reached their lips, disbelief turned into astonishment. Coca-Cola was not just a drink, it was a symbol. In Germany it had been a rare commodity, rationed and almost impossible to find by the later years of the war. For many of these men it had been little more than a rumor, an American novelty whispered about but never experienced. And here they were, captured soldiers, being given something that ordinary Americans drank daily without a second thought. The sweetness shocked them most. After years of sugar shortages, their taste buds had forgotten the richness of abundance. Each sip was a reminder of what Germany could not provide. To be offered Coca-Cola freely and without strings attached was both comforting and humiliating. Comforting, because it was a small gesture of humanity. Humiliating because it revealed just how deep the gulf was between their own crumbling nation and the industrial machine that could give luxuries to its prisoners. In that moment Coca-Cola became more than refreshment. To the POWs it was proof that America's power was real, visible in every bubble rising to the surface of the glass. For the prisoners, the shock of holding a Coca-Cola bottle went far deeper than the taste itself. In Germany the drink had been a rare treasure, rationed tightly and often reserved only for high-ranking officials or black market exchanges. Most ordinary Germans had never even tasted it. Sugar shortages disrupted imports, and the strain of total war made luxuries vanish long before the bombs fell. To those in uniform, even imagining a world where such a drink could be enjoyed casually was impossible. Now in America they were offered Coca-Cola not once, but repeatedly, as though it were water. Guards drank it openly while on duty. Factory workers carried bottles into lunch breaks. Families shared it at picnics. To the prisoners the contrast was unbearable. Something that had been scarce to the point of legend back home was so abundant here that it could be given away to enemy soldiers. Some POWs admitted later that the Coca-Cola was more powerful than any speech or pamphlet. It was propaganda without words, an unspoken reminder that America's resources were vast enough to treat luxuries as everyday staples. They envied the ease with which Americans lived, the sense that even in war they did not have to give up comfort. Sitting in the camps with bottles sweating in their hands, the men realized that they had been lied to. The America described by Nazi leaders as weak and decadent was not only thriving, it was thriving so completely that its prisoners were living better than many German civilians. Coca-Cola in its fizzy sweetness became a symbol of abundance that Germany could never match. The moment ice cream was served in the camps became one of the most unforgettable shocks of captivity. For German POWs hardened by years of war, scarcity, and rationing, the sight of bowls filled with smooth frozen sweetness seemed like a dream. Some stared in disbelief, convinced it had to be some sort of trick. Prisoners whispered to one another, uncertain if what they were seeing was real. In Germany, ice cream had been rare even in peacetime, and by the later years of the war it had vanished entirely from civilian life. To imagine that a nation at war could afford to give such luxuries to its prisoners was beyond comprehension. The first spoonful was almost overwhelming. Cold, creamy, and rich with sugar, it was a sensation most had forgotten. The prisoners tasted not just ice cream, but the comfort of normal life, a sweetness that reminded them of home, childhood, and summers long before the war. Some laughed openly, unable to contain their delight. Others grew quiet, shaken by the realization that America's surplus was so immense it could spill over even into its prison camps. Guards treated the event casually as though it were nothing unusual. To them, ice cream was as ordinary as bread, something served in schools, homes, and soldiers' mess halls. But to the POWs it was extraordinary, a vivid symbol of abundance that no amount of propaganda could deny. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any lecture. While German cities starved and families rationed scraps, America was feeding its enemies dessert. The shock was joyful, yes, but it carried with it an undercurrent of disbelief that turned into quiet respect. Ice cream, like Coca-Cola, became proof that America's strength was not just military, it was cultural, social, and industrial. For the German prisoners, ice cream quickly became more than a dessert. It was a symbol, an edible sign of what abundance truly meant. In Germany, every calorie had been fought for. Families scraped together meals from turnips, black bread, and ersatz substitutes. Children grew thin as rations dwindled. Soldiers at the front often survived on meager portions that left them constantly hungry. Against this backdrop, ice cream represented an impossible luxury. What struck the POWs most was not simply that it existed, but that it was served casually. There were no celebrations, no ration cards, no special occasions. In America, it was ordinary enough to offer to prisoners of war. The casualness of it spoke volumes. If a nation could afford to give its enemies ice cream, what must it be providing to its own citizens and soldiers? Some prisoners later admitted that this moment marked the collapse of a central lie. Nazi propaganda had portrayed America as weak, soft, and incapable of sustaining war. Yet here was proof that even in the middle of global conflict, Americans had resources to spare. Ice cream was not weakness, it was strength disguised as sweetness. The shock gradually gave way to respect. The POWs could not help but admire a society so secure in its power that it treated luxuries as everyday staples. Ice cream became a quiet reminder of what Germany lacked, not just food, but the system that made abundance possible. It was a taste of democracy's hidden strength. For German prisoners of war, one of the most unsettling discoveries came not from military power or battlefield defeats, but from the everyday lives of ordinary Americans on work details outside the camps. They saw factory workers arriving in cars owned not by officers, not by elites, but by average laborers. Back home, even many professionals could not dream of such a luxury. In Germany, only the wealthy or well-connected could afford automobiles, and fuel shortages kept most off the road. Yet here in America, cars lined the streets like tools, owned by people no different from the POWs themselves. It was not only the cars. The POWs noticed the boots American workers wore, sturdy, well-made, and plentiful. German soldiers at the front often marched with patched or worn-out footwear, their supplies stretched thin by years of war. But in America, laborers had more than one pair, switching them out with ease. Even small details struck hard. Workers' lunch pails filled with sandwiches, fruit, and even sweets. These were not rations carefully measured out by the state, but meals prepared casually, as though abundance were simply a fact of life. The prisoners were struck by how ordinary wealth seemed here. What had been privileges in Germany, transportation, durable clothing, hearty meals, were everyday expectations for the American working class. The envy was sharp, but it came wrapped in wonder. If average laborers lived this well, how powerful must the nation truly be? The contrast was more than economic, it was psychological. It shattered the carefully built illusions of Nazi propaganda. The POWs realized that they were not only fighting a stronger army, but also facing a society where prosperity was woven into daily life. The more time German prisoners spent observing life in the United States, the clearer their realization became. Ordinary American workers lived better than many of Germany's elites. It was not only about the cars in driveways or the boots on workers' feet. It was about the standard of life itself, something so consistent and widespread that it defied everything they had believed. In Germany, comfort had always been the privilege of a narrow class. Party officials, senior officers, and wealthy industrialists could afford meat at every meal, quality clothing or leisure goods. For the average citizen, and even for many officers, such things were beyond reach. The war had deepened the divide. Rations shrank, shortages spread, and only those closest to the regime could maintain the illusion of plenty. By contrast, America seemed to erase those boundaries. Workers owned homes with electricity and running water. Families bought more food than they could finish. Radios, refrigerators, and even automobiles were not luxuries for the elite, but expectations for the average household. To men raised on the belief that democracy was weak and decadent, this was an unanswerable contradiction. Some POWs admitted that their deepest shock was not America's military might, but its equality of comfort. They saw a society where prosperity reached the factory floor and the farm field, not just the upper ranks. It was a revelation that gnawed at them. If democracy could provide so much to so many, perhaps the Nazi vision of superiority was hollow. Respect followed shock. What they witnessed in America planted doubts that no amount of speeches or propaganda could erase. They had not only been defeated by soldiers, they had been outlived by a system stronger than any army. For German prisoners, who had grown up steeped in Nazi propaganda, one of the greatest shocks came not from machines or weapons, but from the people operating. When sent on labor details near American factories, they expected to see men who looked like the German ideal: strong uniform, discipline. Instead, they saw something that their ideology had told them was impossible: women and minorities running massive production lines with precision and authority. Inside the plants, women stood on platforms guiding cranes that moved steel beams the size of locomotives. Others welded hulls, assembled engines, or inspected weapons. These were not temporary helpers or token workers. They were the backbone of the operation, working long shifts and keeping production flowing day and night. The sight directly contradicted everything the prisoners had been told. In Nazi Germany, women were confined to homes and treated as second-class citizens. Yet here, American women operated heavy machinery with confidence, proving themselves essential to the war effort. Equally shocking were the African American and immigrant workers. Prisoners watched them manage drilling equipment, drive forklifts, and keep assembly lines moving with tireless efficiency. Many Germans had been raised on the poisonous myth that such people were incapable of skilled labor or leadership. But in America they saw a different reality. Minorities not only contributing but thriving in roles critical to victory. The ideological conflict was intense. Every weld sparked on the factory floor, every truck loaded by a worker of color, every crane operated by a woman struck at the core of Nazi belief. If these supposedly weaker groups could power the world's greatest industrial machine, then what did that say about the myths they had believed? For many prisoners, this moment shattered propaganda more effectively than any speech. America's strength was not built on exclusion but on inclusion, and it was winning the war. If the presence of women and minorities on the factory floor shattered ideology, the sheer scale of production finished the work. German prisoners who were taken on labor assignments near America's great industrial centers struggled to believe what their eyes told them. They saw a single factory produce more steel, ships, or vehicles in a month than entire German regions could manufacture in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, blast furnaces roared day and night, churning out thousands of tons of metal daily. Endless trains rolled in with iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania, feeding fires that never cooled. To men who had once believed German industry was unmatched, the contrast was humiliating. At shipyards along the coast, POWs watched as Liberty ships slid down launch ramps week after week. In Germany, a ship was a monumental effort, consuming months of labor and resources. Here, vessels were launched in such numbers that they became routine. Workers joked about deadlines and complained of overtime, while turning out more ships in a single month than the German Navy had launched in an entire year. It was not only speed but scale. Warehouses stretched longer than city blocks, stacked to the ceiling with spare parts. Cranes moved across skylines like mechanical giants, loading materials for production lines that never stopped. The prisoners realized that what they thought of as industrial capacity in Germany was only a fraction of what America considered normal. Overwhelmed and silent, many admitted privately that this was the moment they understood the war was already lost. For many German prisoners, the deepest wound did not come from steel or ships, but from food. Hunger had been their constant companion in the Reich, where rations grew smaller every month, and families scoured black markets to survive. When they arrived in America, they expected to find scarcity mirrored in the enemy's land. Instead, they saw abundance so overwhelming it bordered on cruelty. In the camps, meals were served in portions that seemed impossible. Bread still warm from the oven, milk so fresh it foamed in pitchers, meat in quantities they had not seen since before the war. At first the men devoured everything, fearful it might vanish. But what broke their composure was not the abundance itself, it was the waste. In America, half-eaten plates were carried away without a second thought. Perfectly good bread was tossed into bins. Apples with small blemishes were discarded, and entire pots of coffee were poured down drains at the end of a shift. For German soldiers who had watched their children scrape crumbs from tables or seen neighbors faint from malnutrition, the sight was unbearable. Some prisoners wept openly, overcome by shame. Others turned away in anger or disbelief. One officer confessed to his comrades that he felt humiliated not by defeat in battle, but by the casual waste of food in a country so rich it could afford to throw away what Germans considered treasure. The message was inescapable. America's strength was not just in weapons or armies, it was in the ability to provide so much that even its waste was greater than Germany's supply. For the prisoners, this abundance struck deeper than any battlefield defeat. If the sight of wasted food left German prisoners broken, the Christmas season offered a moment of healing they had not expected. In December, camps across America prepared holiday feasts, not only for their own families, but for the very men they had captured. Long tables were lined with turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, and desserts, in such variety that prisoners could hardly believe it was real. For many it was the first time in years they had tasted butter, sugar, or warm pie. But what touched them even more was not the food, it was the kindness behind it. Local communities sent church choirs to sing carols inside the camps. Women baked cookies and delivered them as gifts, sometimes attaching small notes of goodwill in broken German. Children waved shyly at prisoners through fences, offering greetings that felt more like friendship than mockery. These gestures of humanity pierced through layers of bitterness and propaganda more effectively than any lecture could. Prisoners expected humiliation, instead they received dignity. They expected hatred, instead they encountered hospitality. One soldier later wrote that the Christmas service in captivity was the moment he realized America's power was not just in factories or armies, but in its generosity of spirit. For a brief evening, men who had fought fiercely under the Nazi banner felt something different: warmth, calm, and even gratitude. The carols echoing through the winter night were not merely songs, they were reminders that enemies could still see one another as human. In those hours, many POWs quietly admitted that this kindness would stay with them far longer than any battle. It was the first spark of redemption, ignited by compassion. When news of the Normandy landings reached the camps, many German prisoners at first dismissed it as exaggeration. They had been fed propaganda for years, stories of Allied weakness, and of Germany's unstoppable military machine. But then came the newsreels. Projectors flickered to life in camp halls, and what they saw on the screen erased every last illusion. The scale was beyond comprehension. Endless lines of ships crowded the waters of the English Channel, an armada so vast it seemed to stretch to the horizon. Overhead, waves of aircraft darkened the skies, carrying paratroopers, supplies, and firepower that dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe could muster. On the beaches, wave after wave of soldiers stormed ashore, backed by tanks, artillery, and the staggering logistics of a nation that treated the movement of men and machines like clockwork. For the POWs, the shock was visceral. Germany had spoken of Allied cowardice, yet here were tens of thousands of men plunging into fire without hesitation. They had been told that America was a land of softness, yet they watched ordinary workers' sons storm beaches fortified with concrete, mines, and machine guns. The images spoke with undeniable force. This was not weakness, this was overwhelming strength. Some prisoners muttered in disbelief, others sat in stunned silence. One officer later recalled that it was the first time he truly grasped the futility of the war. We had sent rifles against factories, he admitted, horses against engines, courage against resources without end. The D-Day footage was more than film. It was a mirror, forcing German prisoners to confront the truth they had long resisted. The Reichs could not survive against an enemy whose capacity for creation and organization was this immense. If D-Day shattered illusions of military victory, the revelations that followed broke something far deeper. In the weeks after the landings, American authorities began showing prisoners evidence of the concentration camps their own regime had built. At first, many refused to believe it. Years of propaganda had painted such stories as enemy lies, fabrications meant to smear Germany's honor. But the proof was relentless. Grainy footage rolled across the screens, emaciated survivors stumbling from barbed wire fences, heaps of bodies left unburied, gas chambers, crematoria, and the hollow eyes of children who had seen too much. These were not rumors, not Allied inventions, but undeniable images captured by American and British soldiers as they liberated the camps. Letters from home later confirmed the same horrors. The silence in the halls was heavy. Hardened officers stared at the floor, their hands trembling. Younger soldiers wept openly, some covering their faces in shame. Men who had once spoken proudly of Germany's mission now sat broken, forced to confront the reality that their nation had not been a champion of civilization, but its destroyer. For many, this was the true defeat, not the loss of armies or cities, but the collapse of moral ground. Everything they had fought for, the ideology that had filled their speeches and guided their actions, now revealed itself as criminal. One POW later admitted, "It was then we understood that we were not soldiers of honor, we had been tools of murderers." The films ended, but the images did not leave them. They lingered, searing into memory, ensuring that shame and horror would remain long after the war was over. When the war ended and the gates of the camps finally opened, the German prisoners of war did not return home empty-handed. They carried no riches, no weapons, no spoils of conquest. What they brought instead were memories, strange, almost unbelievable stories of life in American captivity. In villages across the ruins of Germany, men told their families of Coca-Cola bottles handed out on hot days, of ice cream served in the mess halls, of chocolate bars that seemed to flow without end. For children raised on turnip soup and black bread, these tales sounded like fantasy. For wives and mothers, they were proof that the world beyond the rubble still held possibilities they had never imagined. The prisoners spoke not only of food, but of a society that produced it in such abundance that luxuries could be given even to enemy. They described the endless lights of American towns, the comfort of trains with padded seats, the laughter of civilians unbroken by bombing raids. These small details painted a picture more powerful than any speech. America's strength was not only in its armies, but in its ability to create plenty for all, even for those it had fought. For the returning men, these memories became seeds of hope. They had seen with their own eyes that life could be different, that democracy and industry together could produce dignity, security, and comfort. In the ruins of their homeland, those lessons mattered more than any propaganda. They showed that Germany did not have to remain chained to the past. A future of abundance was possible, and they had tasted it. In the years that followed, the stories of Coca-Cola and ice cream lived on as more than passing memories. For many former POWs, they became symbols, small luxuries that carried a weight far greater than their sweetness. A bottle of soda or a bowl of ice cream represented a system so confident in its strength, so secure in its abundance, that it could extend generosity even to its enemies. Where Nazi propaganda had painted democracy as weak and decaying, these treats revealed the opposite. A quiet power rooted not in fear but in prosperity and freedom. As Germany struggled through the devastation of the post-war years, these recollections became guiding lights. Men who had once believed in conquest now spoke of industry and cooperation. They told neighbors that a society's greatness was not measured by how tightly it controlled its people, but by how well it provided for them. Coca-Cola and ice cream, ordinary to Americans, became extraordinary proof that democracy worked. They were tokens of a culture that created hope instead of despair. The legacy extended far beyond nostalgia. These POWs became teachers, politicians, farmers and workers who carried with them a new vision for their country. They helped build West Germany into a thriving democracy, inspired in part by what they had seen in those camps. Decades later, when they spoke of their captivity, it was not chains or cruelty they remembered most. It was the shock of being treated with dignity, of tasting luxuries that revealed a different kind of strength. In those small, sweet moments lay the hidden weapon of democracy. Not just the power to win a war, but the ability to transform